Hello everybody. Thank you for joining me. It's going to be a bit of a mixed bag tonight. We're about to experience the new moon that begins the next moon cycle. I'm not sure precisely which moon it is, but it might be Soatsakitom in Blackfoot. Could be the moon where either the raptors, owls particularly, begin mating, or there's an extra season, an extra moon if they don't. Sometimes called the deceptive moon or frog moon. And I've come to the lake, which I haven't visited in a while, hoping to see whether or not the blue herons whether the males are standing their nests. Which is something they do prior to the mating time in order to assert their residency in one of the nests in the social tree. There's one primary social tree. And there are a couple of males sitting nests. Now what I'm really hoping to see isn't just the males sitting the nests, but also their dances, which I've had the privilege of seeing before. And I practice some of those dances to try and understand them viscerally. There's a very large evening convocation of crows. Wild guess at the flock size here is 62. Yeah, it's close. But right now, the herons that are sitting nests, which I can see perhaps two, are not very active. They're just hanging out. And it's a little chilly. Since there's no competition, they're not engaged in their display behavior at the moment. So today's video or discussion will be, as I probably mentioned earlier, a bit of a grab bag. Not sure yet what I'm going to chase or talk about. And I'll be visiting the blue heron tree, which appears to have recently lost a couple of branches. Peculiarly, unexpectedly, a couple of high branches have been lost. They broke off. Of course, we did have some intense wind and storms here for a while, not too long ago. I doubt anyone could get up that tree, but the branches almost look like they've been cut off. And it's interesting that next to the social tree, which is some sort of fir tree with many cones, many cones, there's another tree facing southish. It's to the right of the social tree, which has many old nests in it that get reused each year. But yeah, that tree has definitely lost a major branch off to its left, and I think there were some nests associated with that branch. But the tree to the right of it, facing from north of the tree facing south, that tree usually has a red-tailed hawk nest in it each season. And so those two animals, they raise their young side by side in this possibly unusual situation. Here comes one of the guys who's another active observer of animals, and looks like there's a dead bird in the street. Hey man, good to see you. Not sure what kind of bird it was. Looked like maybe a robin. So perhaps either matters of residency have been relatively settled already in the social tree and I missed the onset, or it's so early that there's no competition and we just have the really early the early asserters, and the audacious ones willing to wait and select their nests early and defend them in a sense, mostly with displays, but occasionally there's some sky chasing stuff going on. And a few days ago I noticed the first yellow jacket, and over the past couple nights I've heard frogs. I found a frog colony that apparently is quite large, which I've passed where it is many times, but I never heard them until recently. A few nights ago for the first time, and a couple times since. And for the past couple days I've seen for the first time in memory the peculiar insects, I think sometimes referred to as field crickets or potato bugs. These are large, wingless, spiky-legged creatures that look incredibly fierce and might be able to get some mandibles, on you, but are generally harmless. They're just extremely fierce looking. And I've seen them out and about. I saw one this afternoon and I saw one last night. And frankly, I don't remember ever encountering them here in San Francisco. Now, of course, people with backyards or who live near fields, this kind of thing, they're much better informed about what lives here, what can live here, than I am, because those little yards and such provide a refuge for living creatures and plants and insects and amphibians and reptiles and birds and so on. But as I don't have a backyard associated with my flat, I don't see much of that, and I don't know anyone with a backyard. So these are some of my recent phenological noticings and concerns. And as I've explained in previous videos, one way to think about phenology, and there are many different perspectives to approach it from, is the transformations in relationships and behaviors of plants, animals, insects, and other fungi and microorganisms and so on over each moon cycle each year in a specific place that one generally becomes intimate with. And any place is sort of my place, but a couple of my places are in Golden Gate Park, where there's a lot of life, but it's not as diverse as it might be. Partly because this, rather than being a wild place, is kind of an invented place. All of this used to be sand dunes and is now along maybe 3.5 miles from the ocean. There's a swath of garden and trees and park. But underneath the soil here is sand because it used to be all sand dunes. So if you lift up the loam to see what's living under there, what kind of detritivores you might find, right? Insects that eat detritus or detritus. You'll see a few familiar creatures occasionally. Earwigs, woodlice, or pillbugs, as they're sometimes called. But mostly what you see are sand fleas by the thousands. It's a very interesting and peculiar ecology. I remember when I first came here, I thought, well, this isn't a real wild place. This is a place humans made. But it's only partly true. There's an aspect of truth there, and there's an aspect of confusion there. Because every place there's life is a living place. And so this is a living place. And has the deep, non-ordinary spirit, magic, and nurturing medicine that living places are naturally effulgent with. It took me a little while because my brain was too confused by ideas. The other day on Facebook, someone posted something claiming that transcendental beings inhabit our subconscious. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but I remember responding something like, well, I think there's some kind of non-ordinary beings that also inhabit our consciousness. And the evidence of this is ideas. I guess originally when we were very small, ideas must have been an astonishing experience. But as we grew up and became enlanguaged, enculturated and exposed to the layered array of ways of structuring memory and imagination, we became vulnerable to some of the traps and confusions associated with our seemingly peculiar capacity for formal representational cognition. And as I've mentioned previously, other animals appear to have aspects of this capability, yet it's not clear that they employ something similar to tokens, right? The way that we use words. And there's lots of interesting confusion orbiting these topics, like the asteroid belt in our solar system. Probably the remains of ancient planets. Maybe they smacked into each other and broke up, and yet remained somehow in relation, even while shattered, forming something resembling a ring around the sun, primarily embodied between Mars and Jupiter. And it's interesting that we associate Mars, whose moons are named Phobos and Deimos. I can't remember which one is which, but I think the approximate translations of those are something like terror and or fear, and so what was the other one? Can't recall at the moment. Wood ducks. That's not the translation. There's a couple of them here. It might be like terror and catastrophe or something like this. And you know, under the pressures of representational cognition, it's relatively common for our coherent, or otherwise generally coherent feelings of identity, self, and safety, predictability, for these things to get all tangled up or even shatter. And in psychology, we have the idea of what we refer to as multiple personality disorder. Yet it's always seemed to me, well, always might be the wrong word, it's long seemed to me that we all have different aspects of consciousness. So that, for example, if I'm attending and concerned about threats, the character of my consciousness takes on a different persona in a way. And that persona is somewhat disembodied, usually. There are exceptions. An immediate threat, such as a car bearing down on me that I hadn't seen before crossing the street, will produce a strong, instantaneous, visceral response that precedes any kind of thinking. But if I'm primarily thinking, and of course there's different kinds of thinking and modes of thinking, we can talk about thinking for different reasons, and that's why the word doesn't have a single sense or even an explicit catalog of senses that we can depend on, because we will always mean something slightly unique and contexted when we use words, but their definitions are rarely contexted in the ways that we use them. And this creates confusion because we might think, for example, that a word or an idea, a concept, is supposed to mean a specific thing, or should mean a specific thing. And when it seems to mean something else, we may become concerned or upset because now we can't tell, well, what is the meaning of the word? Well, there is no the meaning of the word. And the disembodied, decontexted definitions can't supply meaning. They only supply a glimpse into the structured records of the protocols we use with language. So rather than give meanings, and again, what we mean by meaning can change in context, and here I'm talking about the senses of a word's definitions in a dictionary. These can be deceptive to the aspect of our awareness that wants a relatively complete, explicit grasp on meaning or identity or process transformation. And one of the most strange and fascinating words and concepts, ideas that we have that is constantly causing us trouble, and there's a few. One of them is culpability. Whose fault is it? Something goes wrong. Whose fault is it? Is it my fault? Is it someone else's fault? Should there be a court case? And of course, from childhood we're scripted to, first, we may have a visceral or a fundamental sense of something being good or not good, someone being kind or unkind, an act that feels to us to be just in the sense of good and true and virtuous, or an act that feels unjust, wrongdoing, harm. And this leads to really significant problems because in modern cultures, we're scripted to undergo uptake of the origins of what we refer to as our legal system. And this word is involved, the origins and roots of this word are related to the idea of legitimacy and also of religion. You can hear these ledge sounds, right? Leg, literally. Oh, there's a running rat. Now, you see, I've just seen a rat. Is that good? Is it bad? Is it legitimate? Was it a hallucination? Am I supposed to see a rat? Or should I be not supposed to see a rat? Right? There's certain little mindlets in the asteroid field of consciousness. And of course there are planets there too, but where things are broken up, it can become very confusing for us poor human beings, mostly because the contexts in which we will encounter ideas like courtrooms, supposed to, justice and injustice, have largely been captured by specific aspects of our capacity for representational cognition, primarily as they are instanced in collectives. And if the collectives are mostly themselves just representations, then we end up doubling down on the origins of the problems that plague our lives and minds. But I think it's a terrible tragedy that happens to us, or really a series of tragedies that happen to us in childhood as we're undergoing the processes of enlanguaging and enculturation. Because we get imprinted with whatever the currently popular or instanced versions of mostly absurd, litigious thoughts, concerns, ideas, processes, institutions, courtrooms, lawyers, prisons, jails, police, surveillors, judges, juries. And in a way, it's very difficult for most of us to resist internalizing these things. So somehow, this is a really complex mess. Because somehow, first, the nature of our collectivity, our togetherness, is generally captured and counterfeited in 1,000 different ways. Primary ways having to do with money, power, social hierarchy, ownership of property, objects, ideas about rights, and these kinds of things. So, firstly, there's a problem where the authenticity of our collectives is lost or captured and then represented to us in institutional and societal forms. And then as children, we take on the imprint of these forms, which are already like second or third or fifth or 50th order representations. And we internalize them, creating a bizarre sort of structured reflection of how and why we've come into contact with these ideas and how they've affected our feelings, our lives, our relationships, but particularly our interiority, our own mind's relationship, in a sense, we could say with itself, but it's not really relating with itself, it's relating with the representations. And so we end up forming little aspects of consciousness, mindlets, if you will, that specialize in navigating the really bizarre terrain that results when something authentic is first represented culturally, then internalized and re-represented in relations with our own being, our own feelings, our own consciousness, so that we can have the experience of being judged or surveilled by beings that don't really exist and aren't judging or surveilling us, except essentially in our imagination. It doesn't mean no one's judging or surveilling us. It just means that we're not really in relation with those judges or possible surveillors. We're in relation with the reflection, the represented reflection of our history and responses to such things. And our reactions and projections of such things. And for many of us, this is a kind of torture, especially when we're under stress, or we're injured, or we're sick, or we're isolated, or we're very poor, or we're homeless, or we're battered, or we've been raped, or abused, or ignored, or evicted. And so, in these circumstances, these aspects of consciousness become very inflamed, and they can become inflamed in all kinds of different ways. And the little mindlets can overcome, with their intense scrutiny of very specific concerns, fears, injustices, they can overcome the coherence of our mind. And then our mind collapses into a situation where the roots of our experience of being human, being a specific kind of human, perhaps a specific gender of human, these experiences when dominated by, for example, a threat sentinel or a judge, or something that's trying to determine whether something is just or unjust, virtuous or bad, these aspects of mind can overcome and dominate the roots of our being in consciousness, so that the mind now finds itself, or we find ourselves, in a war inside ourselves. And the soldiers of this war, the commanders and generals and soldiers and sergeants and so forth, they, so to speak, they are not concerned with preserving the coherence of our felt sense of being. Like our institutions in our society, rather than becoming truly concerned with resolving problems, they become concerned with continuing to exist and to be the aspect of mind that gets funding. Funding meaning attention, energy, awareness, inaction. And in this situation, our mind is prone to collapse into very narrow, painful, and constrictive behaviors and qualities and experiences. Now, usually if we were going to evaluate such a state, we would say, oh, this is a state of grave disorientation. And that's not unreasonable. But that's not the only thing that's going on. Actually, what's happening often is a kind of injury. And there may also be, we may also be seeing symptoms of historical injury reenacted, right? Because if I become extremely concerned about some kind of wrongdoing I was involved in, it is as if I'm reliving that wrongdoing. I can remember events and situations where I made decisions or choices that I later deeply regretted. And when I call these to mind, it's almost as if I'm re-experiencing them. So in a way, or at least from one perspective, the little mindlets, they are concerned with something not entirely dissimilar to ghosts. Memories of beauty or joy or comfort, memories of adventure or heroism, but also memories of wrongdoing, injustice, harm, pain, suffering, fear, confusion, helplessness, injury, illness, these things. Our minds can be analogized as vehicles, and the concerns that produce specialized elements, such as the threat sentinel, the opportunity sentinel, and these are just some words I made up to talk about this stuff, or the relational sentinel, right, the one who watches over relationships, the evaluative sentinel. Is it good? Is it bad? Do I want more of it? Less of it? Do I not care? There are all these little sort of mindlets, processes that over time acquire their own history of origin, inaction, success and failure. But among these, one of the strangest ideas of all, and it's not strange in that we can't understand how it comes to be or why we might refer to it, but it's the idea of supposed to. This is not supposed to be like this, or this is supposed to be some way that it's not being. And this becomes very confusing and troubling for many of us. It would be nice if we had better language around all of these things, particularly the idea that we form little subminds. So we just had an incoming Canadian goose couple. And taking off and landing, but also flying, can be a very vocal behavior for these beautiful creatures, ancient and noble. I don't think they make sophisticated song because they're supposed to. Now, in a way, you can see, if you look throughout history, a very complex relationship with the idea of supposed to. Right? Apparently, humans were so confused at some point about supposed to that either something very powerful and surprising carved a bunch of supposed tos into some stones and gave them to a guy with a halo to deliver to the people that we're his people. And all throughout our religious books and our philosophical ideas, there's a background that we really need a better language for. A background of supposed to's and not supposed to's. And one of the problems with that is that actual experience differs from rule-based protocols. Rule-based protocols are abstract, and many of them are presumed to, it is presumed rather that it is proper to attend the abstract protocols rather than having the contextual sensitivity to be selective about which of them might get enacted or questioned or resolved. Now, this is very confusing and very painful for nearly everyone, but there are some people who are absolutely tortured by it, because for them the abstractness can come to represent interiorly absolute authority, right? And an absolute rule that is to dominate every possible context and situation. And this is why our religions are so problematical, because in many of them, it's not clear whether they started out this way, but over time they became weaponized. And the evidence of weaponization is the promise either of eternal bliss or eternal torture. These promises are taken as absolute. The protocols are taken as absolute. They pervade over all possible things. And that collapses into an abstract rule-based system that no living being can reasonably contend with. In fact, that kind of weaponization produces various kinds of what we would refer to as madness. And sometimes the madness is angry, but sometimes it's just wildly incoherent within itself to such a degree that those suffering from it cannot compose anything resembling coherent human mindful experience. And it's a terrifying tragedy, and one we are all, not out of reach of most of us, because when we're placed under enough stress or isolation and so on, most of us are inclined to overfund an aspect of awareness that's attacking the basis of our minds, though we cannot detect that with the minds less compromised. Or we may have an intuition that something's wrong in our mind. But because the dominant processes are so expensive and ravenous, right? Endlessly hungry for any kind of fuel or power they can sequester, capture from consciousness and awareness, we can fall into all kinds of traps where an aspect of awareness that might otherwise, if not super inflated, be at least modestly useful in coping with trouble or loss, threat or pain, inverts and effectively becomes the source of trouble or loss or pain or confusion. And I suspect this is familiar to most of my listeners because all of us have experienced something like this. Particularly if we are faced with a problem, something painful, for a long period of time, and particularly if that problem has old roots in our developmental, what we might call psychology, but the development of our minds. And again, I just want to mention that it's not like we have one mind, although, depending on how we frame it and why we're looking, what our purposes are, what we're curious about, we'll come up with different models of mind and mindedness. Usually there is a kind of relatively coherent, what should I call this? A root aspect of my being and identity that I think of as me, right? And it supersedes all subfunctions. Yet it can collapse into or toward a given subfunction, so that now my experience of me, rather than being broad and diverse and alive and sensitive and creative and reverent and playful, becomes courtroom-like. And so in these cases I've collapsed into a mindlet, a sub-process, probably one I inherited from culture and language, but also one that, whether or not it's mostly artificial, is the remains of something important. Something primordial. Something that was visceral before it was conceptual or represented. Right? And this is part of how the gambit works. In our interiority, something deeply true and primordial is first buffered so that it becomes difficult to access, and then we're presented in culture, society, language, ideas with something that resembles it but is a counterfeit. And this is the root, is one way to understand the roots of our vulnerability to these issues. And this happens all day, every day, in cultures of commodity and commerce. They're hyper-representational. They're actually chasing dissociation, disembodiment, the replacement of a meaningful human interiority with arrays of ever more structured, technological, and confusing fictions. And one would imagine that it would be brilliant if in childhood we could be educated about these things, so that we would have the opportunity to become curious enough about them that we might overcome many of the traps and take advantage of the peculiar opportunities that honestly are mostly missing from our common experience as adults. But rather than that kind of education, we get the other kind that reinforces the representation problem. Loss, figuration of the lost thing, counterfeiting of the lost interior asset, feelings, experiences of meaningful relation and identity, authenticity. These just get paved over the same way our living places do, so that cars can drive on them, and most of those cars have nothing to do with, well, let's just say they're extremely expensive to continue supporting. So many of us will arrive at early adulthood or late adulthood largely deprived of the assets we brought to our human incarnation, and trapped in a kind of hall of mirrors of representations and commodities that mimic what was lost or buried or paved over. And some of us will become very concerned about these matters and may become philosophers or linguists or monastics, because we will want to see through the veils, the layers and layers of confusion that simply being an enlanguaged human being nearly demands. And we'll be very lucky if we can find anyone at all who understands these matters in any way that's useful or medicinal enough to be much help. Now, not all of us are meant for these paths, right? These sometimes very academic or very demanding paths. The path of monastic life is extremely demanding, in a sense. And most of us who will enter such paths will begin in a relatively confused state, right? And so we may pursue paths in life or our development that actually contribute to the problem, at least in the beginning. But it is possible for us to learn and to discover the histories and origins and natures of these problems, and to become gently aware of them, right? Hopefully not obsessively aware, in a way that guides us toward liberation from them. And we have traditions in various cultures surrounding this. Some of them are religious, some are monastic, some philosophical, some creative. In many ways, I trust the creative ones a bit more, because in any process where there's playful exploration, motivated by authentic human concern, there are paths out of the traps that naturally arise there. And I might look at all of this trouble that I've been wandering around and think to myself something like, it's not supposed to be this way. And while that might not be entirely untrue, it's still quite confused. because it's not entirely clear what way it is, or even what it is, or what trustworthy authority we might turn to understand how it is supposed to be. Now, the word itself gives us a clue, because it's a normative word, right? Things are supposed to be some way or not supposed to be some way. When you actually look at the word, it involves a supposition. For something to suppose to be some way, someone has to make the supposition themselves that this is the appropriate way for things and beings to be. And who makes the suppositions? Who does the supposing? What aspects of our mind, awareness, history, habits become involved when we become very concerned with what things are supposed to be or do? And again, there's a normalizing inclination there, and I find it quite suspicious. I wouldn't throw it away entirely, I'd just be very cautious about how and where it rises to authoritative dominance in consciousness and then begins making declarations or assertions. And the idea of supposed to rarely arises unless there's some troubling deviation from our expectations. And normative thought imposes a lot of expectations, unfortunately. I'm going to pause for a moment, and I hope to return to this discussion in just a few minutes. So obviously I have my own purposes and concerns around these matters. And some of them are very local to my own life and mind. And others are concerns I have about other living beings, other human beings, our societies, our cultures, our children, our relationships with each other, with the strange institutions that are largely estranged from our nature as human beings and as animals, with the future of the world. But I don't expect to swallow the moon or eat the ocean. I've come to understand what I've been able to learn about these things because I am deeply concerned. And I'm not merely concerned with injustice, I'm also in love with virtue. Not because I'm afraid of punishment, but because it feels beautiful to be human when I'm able to embody and enact virtuous relationships. Now, of course, this is already a problem, because if we presume the dichotomy of injustice and virtue, now we're stuck, right? I can't be virtuous all the time. Some of my behavior is unjust, and one of the ways this gets embodied in our culture is that the injustices get hidden in the poor and the environment and children and elderly and sick people and poor people and so on. So it's going to be really difficult for me if I start out with the polarity, right? This is good, this is bad. This is what I want, this is what I don't want, and so on. These will produce expectation protocols, judgment protocols, evaluation protocols. And once those become familiar to me from my habit, they will largely become invisible. Right? We have the capacity to learn things that disappear from our volition as they become embodied. And many of our habits of thought and consideration, evaluation, concern, particularly about good and bad, just and unjust, normal and abnormal, these are inclined to be internalized. And that's not meaning, it's not to say that it then becomes hopeless. It just certainly becomes more difficult because we will tend to see and feel our way through situations with what is habitually familiar. It has a kind of gravity that draws us back again and again to reenacting patterns and behaviors that we may actually, in our core, in our essence, in our nature as human beings, we may find these miserable and not like them at all, yet we will enact them over and over again once they become familiar. And that trap's hard to escape from, particularly by oneself. But if we can learn a little bit, at a time, if we can set off on the path of understanding and open our awareness to these peculiarities of our modern humanity, and if we become curious and if we are passionate and playful, we will discover something very surprising. I might say the prisons I've described are made of doors, but these doors are largely invisible to our familiar approaches, our familiar perspectives or angles of concern and interest. Yet all throughout our lives, it remains possible for us to begin to set aside familiar habits that lead to traps and wonder about the nature of all of these things and their historical origins, their cultural origins, their non-ordinary origins. The other night I was talking with my son about similar concerns, and he asked a very peculiar question. I'm not sure if it's his question or another's. I'm not even sure that it matters much. His question was, in our consciousness, why would we place our trust in something so fundamentally insecure as the mind-like processes familiar to our daily lives? It's a brilliant question. It's the kind of question that could reveal many doors if we take it partly playfully and partly seriously. And rather than answering the question, I want to leave it open so that we can pursue it together in our imagination. Which is where, this is the word we have for an aspect of our interiority that is both vulnerable to and capable of liberating itself from the peculiar predicaments of our minds and intelligences and hearts with which we try to navigate our thoughts and feelings, experiences, relationships, and also their absences, and also the mimicry, the counterfeits of them. And perhaps by being able to talk about these things together, we can embark on a path that leads to freedom. For if we are not free in our own minds and interiority, the physical freedoms of our daily lives quickly pale and can even become meaningless patterns of repetitive behavior in which, although our bodies are surviving and we may be being fed and sheltered and we may even be lucky enough to have relationships, they will collapse slowly for some, quickly for others, into shell-like constructs that are uninhabitable because their dimensionality is so impoverished that there's no air, there's no oxygen for our hearts, there's no oxygen for our intelligences and the aspects that we might associate with our souls. I'm not sure that liberation is an achievement. Many traditions clearly declare that there is nothing to achieve, and that the real trap is believing in a distinct, continuous self. And there's some useful, perhaps even virtuous potential there. But even those of us who will not in this lifetime seek what we presume to be ultimate liberation, and there is no end of such a path, it's an infinite path. Even for those of us who are not inclined to pursuits in that direction, we can learn and discover and grow and come to understand the peculiar traps and predicaments that we often may find ourselves twisted up in such a way that we can release our grip and no longer be compelled to the kinds of intrinsically conflicted ideas and assertions, logics, laws, rules, protocols that we picked up as our minds developed in cultures that were mostly opposed to their liberation and somehow intent upon their capture. And to whatever degree we may make progress together in this matter, authentic, trustworthy progress, we will be healed, we will be nourished, and we will discover astonishing depths to our minds and our humanity and our animal nature, our organismal nature, our essential nature, that are freely available when we are not otherwise concerned. This is my hope, this is my dream, this is my prayer today. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.